Thanks, Michael, and thanks to NAB for setting this up and the invitation to speak today. A very quick potted history. We've got 10 minutes to get through quite a lot. In fact, 12 years worth of work at Rio Tinto. And I guess what I want to do is really just demonstrate, a process and a methodology we've put in place, and to use some of the terminologies that we've been talking about today and we'll talk about later on this afternoon. It's really about how Rio Tinto is internalising the externality of biodiversity. And looking at this from an issue in terms of both risk and opportunity for the organisation. Also, thanks to Will for providing such a great introduction. This slide was meant to cover a lot of the stuff you've just done, but I guess you've very clearly outlined, one of the important differences between biodiversity and ecosystem services. This program is very much focused on the building blocks of ecosystem services in terms of the biodiversity. And one of the things we discovered very quickly is we share a lot of, similar issues to the conservation community and how they're dealing with biodiversity issues. It's interconnected, it's enormous, it's hard to measure, it's hard to manage. We use a lot of the same methodologies. We use the pressure state response model in terms of how we're analysing this. And right at the beginning there, a lot of the work that I'm going to go through very quickly could not have occurred without some of the strategic relationships we have with some of the world's leading NGOs, Conservation International, Fauna and Flora International, Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, BirdLife, and some of the leading thinkers out of places like Cambridge, and Guy Dutson's over there from a group called the Biodiversity Consultancy. This work would not have happened without those inputs. It's not something Rio's dreamt up and thrown on the table. Why is this important for us? That just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of the current Rio profile at the moment. As you probably are aware, we're sort of a global miner, diversified miner. Historically, most of our operations have been in Australia, North America and Europe. Over the next 20 to 40 years, the distribution of those offsets, those operations is going to change. We're going to find ourselves working in West Africa, the former Soviet states, and in South America a lot more. Now, really, in terms of business case, what that means is that the biodiversity strategy work that we're developing is a tool that will help us maintain access to land when competition for land is going to only increase into the future. Agriculture, expanding populations are all driving a much deeper thinking in terms of what land uses are appropriate in what regions. And I guess by putting in place the biodiversity strategy, what we're saying is that we have the tools in place to enable us to liberate mineral resources, but not throw the biodiversity baby out with the bathwater. And we made in 2004 what was then a rather audacious statement in terms of the company feels that it can have a net positive impact on biodiversity in the regions that we work. And since 2004, we've been working on developing the methodologies, the tools, and now implementing those, working to achieve that long-term gain. That's just a couple of the other elements in terms of business case. I want to point specifically to the second piece about maintaining access to capital. And that's certainly something that's changing quite dramatically and has changed quite dramatically over the last couple of years. And if you have a look at the IFC Performance Standard 6, which is specifically around biodiversity, that had a revision last year. And in the space that I work in, I've never really seen one piece of policy change the dynamics of what's going on, certainly within the extractors in the oil and gas. That piece of policy there and that performance standard is really changing and driving a lot of behaviour in this space. In terms of the approach, what we've done is we've developed a policy. As I said before, the long-term goal is a net positive impact on biodiversity. We don't aggregate that up. There's not a single metric for Rio Tinto as a whole. It's dealt with at the operational level. And I guess the aim is to achieve MPI by the closure of the operation, or where appropriate and where applicable, as early in the life of that operation as possible. And we have a series of principles around that. And there's also a set of principles around biodiversity offsetting, which, as you'll see in the next slide, is a key component about delivering that. Now, you can actually get more information on all of this on our website, riotinto.com/MPI. That's all available there if you want to have a deeper dive. In terms of, I guess, the structural framework on how we're hoping to achieve this at operations, underpinning the whole lot is what we call the mitigation hierarchy. And many of you would have seen various entities and forms of this in different guises. It's filtering through into government policy around offsets here in Australia, and it's well recognised and used globally. In its simplest form, it's really just a series of steps to, one, minimise the impact of the operation on biodiversity to as much as possible and as much as practicable, using the first three elements there, which is avoidance. The best thing we can do is not impact at all and avoid the impacts wherever possible. Obviously, that gets a little bit difficult for a mining company because the resource we can't move. It sits there, and to access that resource, we have to disturb land. Minimise wherever possible. That's mainly about things like pollution control, reducing impacts through water discharge, things like that. Then there's obviously a large component about rehabilitation, although we're very cognizant of the fact that you can't restore exactly what was there before, but we feel that in certain situations using restoration ecology practices, you can deliver some forms of biodiversity value in that restoration work. Now, traditionally, that would have left us with a residual impact, the hole in the ground, the old infrastructure that was there. So what we're then saying is through the use of compensation mechanisms like biodiversity offsets, you can then compensate for that residual impact and depending upon what you're putting in place on the ground and the conservation interventions that you're putting in place on the ground, actually generate a net gain within the region that you're working in. And I guess we're quite specific about that. It's not about compensating every blade of grass that's disturbed. It's about looking at what the biodiversity values are in the region, what are the impacts on those regions, and in a lot of cases, we're working. Our operations have quite discrete footprints. In the orders of 100 hectares to 1,000 hectares, and you're working in an environment where there is a very large level of background loss of biodiversity value, either through agricultural practices or even through sustainable use in some of the countries that we're working in, such as Guinea, Madagascar and others. So the idea there is to work with others, not ourselves, but to work in partnership, to look at how we can try and change land use practices in the surrounding areas to deliver a biodiversity gain, which then are related back to the values that we're dealing with at the operation. It's an embryonic piece. The whole biodiversity offsets agenda and framework is still in its very early stages. There's still a lot of issues to overcome, but there's certainly starting to be, I guess, a fairly large head of steam around this. The key delivery tool at the operations is what we call our biodiversity action planning piece, and this is where we start to look into what the biodiversity values are. And obviously this discussion will talk about valuisation or valuing those biodiversity features later on. We generally at this stage don't tend to put a monetary value on that. We look at things basically from a compliance, regulatory, stakeholder or reputational values. Although we are doing work now that is actually looking at financial values as well, so we can feed those into cost-benefit analysis in terms of the programs that we're putting in place on the ground. It underpins the whole thing. It's where we put in place the MPI accounting, which I just said before was based upon the identification of the biodiversity values, and I guess assigning a ranking to those. What it really tries to do is take, I guess, some of the conservation practices, put those onto the ground so that we can look at generating loss gain calculations around two specific metrics. One is an area quality metric, so what we call quality hectares, and that's quite common in frameworks around the world. The Bush Broker scheme here in Melbourne has a very analogous system to that. And where we can't, where we've got a biodiversity value such as a species issues that we're dealing with, that you can't relate that back to an area, quality area measure, we look at species-specific metrics and normally units of global distribution. And we draw very heavily from the IUCN and methodologies within the IUCN Rentless and others. And, I'm an ecologist by training, but I haven't done any ecology for a long period of time. So if you've got any questions about those, actually Guy's the person to ask because he's doing the cutting edge stuff at the moment. We've actually published just recently a piece on that. This is a bit of work that we published in conjunction with the IUCN. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, this is the piece to have a look at. It's a really deep dive into the whole biodiversity accounting methodologies that we've applied to the QMM project in Madagascar. Just looking once again, we're sort of dealing with the values propositions, and Pavan had a very similar slide up on his site, and Will, you had something similar, looking at biodiversity and ecosystem services and the different elements within those. We're pretty confident that we're getting quite advanced in terms of looking at metrics around species and habitats. We've still got a bit to go in terms of ecosystem services functions and valuations and metrics around those. I'll flick through that really quickly. That's just to give you a bit of an overview. That's from the QMM project. We don't aggregate. We look at values on a line-by-line basis and look at doing the accounting on a line-by-line basis. We don't look at trading littoral forests in Madagascar for pandas in China. It's just, you can't do it, it's not appropriate. So it's a local case-by-case. That's just a predictive model in terms of, and we're looking at forest area here for the QMM project. The red line there is what we're predicting in terms of loss associated with the project. The various colours are looking at potential gain scenarios based upon a baseline counterfactual of current biodiversity loss moving forward through to 2065. So by putting in place conservation and actions in the ground, if they're successful, they're the anticipated gains that we are hoping to get in those regions. The reality is that the accounting's easy. The application on the ground is incredibly hard, and it's not the biodiversity issues that are the hard part, it's the political and social issues that you're dealing with in those regions that are the hard part. I would imagine I'm running out of time, so just very quickly on the valuation piece, we used to use the term natural capital within Rio. I've stopped that. That was causing major confusion. We now talk about biodiversity and ecosystem services because Rio Tinto, the mineral resources we're accessing on the ground are actually a natural capital. So every time we talk about natural capital in this context, you have to say, yeah, but it doesn't mean the bauxite deposit. So we're dropping it from the lexicon because it is causing confusion. We are looking at valuing. We've got two major programs on the run at the moment. That first one actually was one of the first pieces that we did with the IUCN, and actually Josh was one of the co-authors on that with his colleague Natalie Olsen. We've got two projects running at the moment, one in conjunction with the IUCN and CSIRO, and that's looking at the value of water, groundwater in the Pilbara. We've got a major issue as we move forward in the Pilbara in terms of how we deal with groundwater to dewater for mining. And we're looking at a number of scenarios. The idea here is that we'll feed this information into our cost benefit and I guess our decision-making processes on how to generate the best added value for the use of that water. And one of the things that we're looking at is can we use that water to actually grow hay in the Pilbara so that we could potentially destock about 1.5 million hectares of pastoral station, which then gives us the opportunity to look at fire management and weed control over those to generate a biodiversity gain. Interestingly, and I guess this is part of the discussion for today, we've got a piece that's running on just doing natural valuation using choice modelling. That will produce a dollar value for this. We don't feel that's appropriate for traditional owners because they see the value of water very differently. So I guess in this discussion about putting a dollar value on things, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that in some jurisdictions from some stakeholders, that dollar value is meaningless. They don't see the world in that way. You have to have multiple metrics in this space. And this last piece is about dealing with that, where we're looking at the value of non-timber forest products for the project in Madagascar that I was talking about, and looking at, okay, well, if we're asking local communities to change land use practices to reduce biodiversity pressures, so for instance, stop chopping down trees to burn for charcoal, they obviously need to be compensated for those land use changes, given that they live on a day-to-day basis. And as Pavan put up with that slide about the value of ecosystem services in these non-OECD countries, they're totally reliant on those forests for the food that they eat. The catch-22 is that the population increases in those areas is also putting so much pressure on those forests that they're basically destroying them as they move forward. So this is looking at how we can then try to link the whole thing together. I'll leave it at that.